Yes.
Excellent. Good evening and welcome to the Finance Committee meeting of Tuesday, November 2nd. This is a special meeting being held virtually. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Yes, of course. Vice Mayor Burt.
Here.
Chair Cormack.
Here.
Councilmember Filseth.
Here.
3 present.
Thank you so much to the clerk. We'll begin this evening with oral communications when members of the public may address us about any item within the purview of the Finance Committee that is not on tonight's agenda. Tonight we have one action item, which is on public safety, long-term financial trends, specifically the fire department. So we'll take a moment and see how many people would like to address us this evening. All right, we're going to go ahead and begin with Ken Horowitz. Ken, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. This is Ken Horowitz. I live on Homer Avenue in Palo Alto, and I look forward to sharing my comments with you this evening. I was at the council meeting last night, and I wanted to share some more thoughts about a sugar sweetened beverage tax. And I know the committee is looking at and has done work on the business tax regarding polling and tax revenues. So I wanted to share you a little bit about the tax revenues associated with the sugar beverage tax in Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco. In Oakland, for the years from July 17th to December 19th, 2.5 years, the tax revenues from the soda tax was $25 million. $25 million. San Francisco soda tax for the past year was $10 million, and of which 1.65 million they allocated for emergency food relief for those who were struggling to afford food. So a very beneficial use of the soda tax in San Francisco. In Berkeley, the tax for fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21 was allocated to be $4.75 million. Now the taxes in Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco are at 1 cent per ounce. I don't see there's any reason why we in Palo Alto could consider a 2 cent per ounce beverage tax for soda. And that probably would raise at least $1 million, probably closer to $1.5 million for programs that will benefit the residents of Palo Alto. So I encourage you to pursue the polling and to pursue the tax revenue possibilities for a sugar sweetened beverage tax, and hopefully bring it forward to the city council for the November 8th meeting, in which they are looking at potential revenue sources for the city. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. And would anyone else like to address us? Seeing none, if the clerk would please confirm that.
Yes, there are no other speakers for oral communications.
All right, that concludes oral communications. Now we move on to our action item, which is to receive and discuss a report on public safety long-term financial trends. And I'll turn it over to staff for the presentation.
I think Danny is pulling up the slides. And actually it'll be a combination, or I should introduce myself. Good evening, Kylie Jose, Administrative Services Director. And we have before us tonight what will be a joint presentation. Our city manager will kick us off, and then Budget Manager Jesse Deschamps and Fire Chief Gio Blackshire will round out the presentation for the committee tonight. So with
So I
that, I
think we
think I,
call it an ensemble cast or something to that effect.
yes.
Yeah, happy to lead off. You bet. Why don't we go
Thank
ahead
you.
and get started with our first slide? And as we're doing that, or next slide, sorry, Danny. As we're doing that, I just want to lead off by thanking the committee and really the council, as this has been an item that has included both the full council as well as the committee in taking up this topic. We'll call it long-term financial trends, needs, or actually, as it was referred to a couple of years ago now, fiscal sustainability. And also thank the fire department for really being something of the guinea pig here, or the leader really in our current round of discussion of this really important topic. Would note, just as we have this slide up, which again comes back to March of 2019, where we were having in some ways the same discussion in a different context clearly, but nonetheless along similar thread to look at means by which strategies we have for ensuring long-term fiscal sustainability of our various services. And really, again, thank the fire department for leading off, especially because it can be easy to assume that the conversation's all about cutting costs and identifying the mechanical, at some level, means by which we contain costs. And that would really, in the context of the council's multi-year discussion, be a misunderstanding of the ongoing diligence that the city organization has taken on this topic. And really both the strategic perspective as well as the ongoing moves really over the course of years that we've taken to address this really important issue. The graphic that we have in front of you at this point with this triangle of services, resources, and the cost of doing business is something that in our discussions of this topic coming up for the committee's discussion, we thought might be helpful as a framing introduction in that, as we will talk a lot about the cost of doing business and to a certain extent the dimensions of the resources we have to provide it and the services themselves, that it is important to keep all these dimensions in mind as we drill down on the various strategies that we have, including as we've talked recently, and as we look at this from a citywide perspective, some of the boundary cases. And boundary cases, perhaps not directly in mind when we talk about fire services, but if we take for granted that fire and emergency medical services is a core service and essential service that the city provides, that at some point, as again, from a boundary case perspective, if we assume that is an essential service and take that for granted, then the discussion turns to, so how do we deliver those services most effectively? And then finally, what are the resources and perhaps even the financial resources that we use to address those needs? If this were a utilities context that we were discussing it, we would be considering a rate base and a means of paying for those costs. Once again, we were convinced and to the extent that we are comfortable that those costs are managed in a manner that's most effective for the time being and based upon strategies going forward. So as we look at boundary cases and are discussing the immediate term cost of doing business, these other dimensions of the services we provide and the resources available to provide those services are important dimensions that I'm sure will be part of our discussions going forward. So with that, let me turn it to Ms. Deschamps to walk us through the particulars of what the fire service and fire EMS service dimensions bring to bear.
Next slide, please, Danny. Perfect. Good evening, Jessie Deschamps with the Office of Management and Budget. We're here this evening to discuss the February 2nd, 2021 Finance Committee referral which stated for the council to direct the finance committee to have an additional review of public safety long-term financial trends, beginning with the fire department and concurrent with the September review of pensions. So included for discussion this evening is an overview of the Palo Alto Fire Department, financial and staffing trends from fiscal year 2012 to 2022, which highlight that expenses have increased at a faster pace than revenues. Cost recovery levels have decreased from 50% to 30%. The overall net cost to the general fund have increased from 9.5% or 15 million to 12.3% or 25 million. And staffing levels have decreased by 31.49 full-time equivalent or FTE positions from 121.74 FTE to 90.25 FTE. We'll also discuss the changes to service delivery and baseline costs, which are the key drivers of these trends, strategies to manage fiscal sustainability, and actions and next steps. I'll turn it over to Chief Blackshire, who will continue with an overview of the fire department and several key changes to service delivery that we're seeing contribute to these trends.
All right, next slide. I think that's me. There we go. Good evening. So for an overview of the Palo Alto Fire Department, this slide is giving a summary of revenue, which includes the Stanford Fire Agreement, which is an agreement we've had with Stanford since 1976, and it was renewed in 2018, and that was a result of an elimination of 11 reduced positions, and we'll talk about that later in the slides. There's the Paramedic Transport Services. This service is not fully cost recovery at 3.5 million because the cost of ambulance is not fully, we're not fully reimbursed by those patients that are Medi-Cal or Medicaid, and they are a majority of our patients. We are eligible to receive reimbursement through the Ground Emergency Medical Transport Reimbursement Program, as well as the Intergovernmental Transfer Program. So that combined helps us recover, but is not a fully cost recovery program. With the subscription program, this is one of the programs that that just went through council as of last night through consent. And this was the program that we were asked to come up with something innovative or something not done before that could be not only help the budget situation in Palo Alto, but also be a good service to the community. And we introduced this, and we are working on this, and we will be launching this in the near future. In addition to the subscription program, we will also be introducing a false alarm fee program, which will be focused on recovering fees for repeat offenders of false alarms. And then moving on to the expenses, salary and overtime. Salaries are negotiated between the labor groups and the city in order to keep the units in service. In regards to overtime, whenever there's vacancies by way of vacation, sick leave, workers' comp, or retirements, etc., we hire back personnel to keep those units in service. When it comes to overtime, we get reimbursed for overtime whenever we provide mutual aid through the State Master Mutual Aid Program. For example, when we send crews to the wildfires across the state, or we send EMTs and paramedics to hospitals across the state when they had that surge in patients for a surge in COVID patients in the emergency room. We also get reimbursed for overtime at Station 8 due to the partnership with Los Altos Hills Fire District and Santa Clara County Fire. Then there's benefits. There's allocated charges, for example, capital purchases such as vehicles, vehicle purchases and maintenance. And there's other expenses for external vendors. For example, our ambulance billing is done that's done through a outside vendor. There's the Foothills Fire Management Plan that we contribute to. And there's also, for example, firefighter physicals, annual physicals that we have done through a vendor. And this is typically done because we just don't have the resources to effectively do that and provide other services. Next slide. Okay, continuing this overview, and as you can see from this this diagram here, it's another way to show how between services, finances, and benchmarks and how that's balanced to maintain our level of service. For example, the service that we provide is, I want to start just by saying it's an exceptional service because we're an all risk. A majority of our calls are medical. Currently, we're at about 71% of our calls are medical, but we also provide fire suppression and prevention, hazmat, technical rescue, and et cetera. And we are an extremely lean department. We're more lean than we've ever been. And we're at the same time, we're busier than we've ever been. Our call volume's increasing over the years as we've leaned out. And we're extremely efficient and cost effective. And from that, the numbers in the lower right corner show that our hit to the general fund is about half as comparable fire departments in the region. So we're very cost effective at providing the same level of service, and we're very, very busy. So in addition to the services, we have to, once we decide what services we provide to the community, there's benchmarking. And benchmarking is a way that we measure the services that in a way to ensure that we're effective. What is a success for us? What does success look like? And it's a way to identify when we're hitting the mark. It's a way to identify when we're not hitting the mark. But this benchmarking, it drives our way to strategic planning, what kind of resources we need, not just people, but equipment, and what level of training do we need to make sure that we can provide those services to the best of our ability. And in order to get those services and benchmarking, considering resources, there's the finance piece. And that's obviously how we pay for our resources, how we pay for our equipment, how much training we give our people, what type of equipment are they using, what kind of apparatus are they driving, PPE are they wearing, et cetera. So that's all things considered. Once we have, it's always tied together with providing the service, what is our mark, and how are we paying for it. So we're always taking those three into consideration when moving forward. Next slide. Is this still me? I think it is. Okay, it is, sure. So changes to the service delivery and costs. So there's the Stanford Fire Protection Services. As I said earlier, we used to cover SLAC, the Standing Linear Accelerated Center, which was Station 7 in Menlo Park, but it was on Stanford property, and therefore it was included in the Stanford contract. That was the 9 FTEs that we lost. And not only did we lose the positions, but as a result of that, we also took a unit out of service, which was the rescue. The rescue was our primary hazmat unit, and they also were a technical rescue unit as well, and they responded to medical calls. In fiscal year 18, we negotiated a contract with Stanford. Again, that was 11 positions, and it was a right sizing, and it did align the revenue to approximately $6.5 million a year. For fire prevention services in 2015, we reallocated fire inspections and plan checking from Palo Alto Fire to planning and development services, which was a reduction in approximately 9 FTEs. And it was a cost neutral action, shifting $2 million in staff expenses and corresponding revenues. And then there's the browning out of Fire Station 2, which was a result of the reductions for fiscal year 21 and 22, eliminating staff approximately 8.6 FTEs at an expense reduction of 1.6. I would also like to say that after observing the impacts that the browning out of Fire Station 2 had on our response, we are trying out a model now that is keeping that fully staffed with a 2-person squad. So it's a unit that we've never had in place before. It's something that we believe is a better, because they can respond to calls 24/7, including weekends, where typically in the evenings and on the weekends. And the last 3 months that we were doing the browning out, it was browned out over 95% of the time. So that district was void of a unit to respond. So now it is fully staffed with a squad and an ambulance. So if we want to talk about more about that deployment, we can, but we, the team went to work and really thought about the most efficient way and effective way that we can make sure that we have all the districts covered with an emergency unit from the fire department. I think that's it for my slides. Next slide.
Okay, in the next several slides, we're going to focus on the financial and staffing trends that have emerged over the prior 10 years and the changes to cost above and beyond these service changes that we were just discussing that are contributing to these trends. So in this graph, the blue and gray bars reflect the actual revenues and expenses from fiscal year 12 to fiscal year 2021 and adopted levels in fiscal year 2022. The blue line indicates the net cost to the general fund, and the green line in access reflects staffing levels. So overall, we're seeing that department revenues aren't keeping pace with the escalating expenses. Over time, the gap to recover costs has widened. In 2012, revenue supported about 50% of costs. In fiscal year 2022, this is closer to 30%. Net costs to the general fund are increasing from 15 million in fiscal year 12 to 25 million in fiscal year 2022. Over this time period, the cost to for the percentage of general fund revenues has been between about 8 and 12%. And then lastly, staffing levels have reduced by nearly 32 positions from 121.74 FTE to 90.25 FTE. As discussed in the previous slide, many of these reductions related to service changes. Next slide, please. So again, above and beyond, the service changes that we discussed, the department has experienced increasing baseline costs, primarily in salary and benefits. For salaries, the wages and terms of employment are negotiated as part of the bargaining process and outlined in the Memorandum of Agreements, or MOAs. Prior MOAs for IAFF and FCA have included a 2.5% to 3% annual increase and market adjustments. These groups also deferred wage increases from July 2020 to July 2021 to offset the attrition of position reductions in fiscal year 21 and 2022. And these MOAs expired June 30th, 2022. Pension expense with regards to increasing employer costs. For purposes of this conversation, we're using the CalPERS ADC, or actuarial determined contribution, to describe impacts to cost. The ADC is an estimate for total employer contributions. It includes both the normal cost and unfunded accrued liability, or UAL, expressed as a percentage of payroll. So overall, the ADC for safety plans has increased from 30% of payroll in fiscal year 12 to 70% of payroll in fiscal year 2022. This cost is anticipated to increase to a peak of 74% in fiscal year 2025 and taper thereafter. Rising pension costs can in part be attributed to assumption changes in plan experience that does not meet expectation. So several notable occurrences in the prior years has included the lowering of the discount rate from 7.75% in fiscal year 12 to 7.7% in fiscal year 2020. The reducing of the amortization period from 30 to 20 years for new UAL bases beginning in fiscal year 2022, and instances where actual investment returns differed from expected returns. Next slide, please. So looking forward, there are several near-term changes that will impact costs beginning in fiscal year 2024. The first is the favorable investment return of 21.3% versus the 7% target for the period ending June 30th, 2021. As a result of this, the CalPERS risk mitigation policy was triggered, and the discount rate has been reduced from 7 to 6.8%. Additionally, every 4 years, CalPERS completes an asset liability management, or ALM, and experience study to set the discount rate and other economic and demographic assumptions. These will be completed this month in November 2021. And then lastly, we've seen an upward trend in workers' comp costs in recent period. This is due to increasing claims for strains and other cumulative trauma events. Also, post-traumatic stress is a new qualifying presumption. Next slide. Strategies to manage fiscal sustainability. So the city is engaged in multiple solutions to address fiscal sustainability, and staff continues to work with the council on a number of different avenues to generate revenues and manage expenses. On the revenue side, the city continues to explore new revenue streams and cost recovery level of fees. An example of this is the new SAFER grant for staffing resources and the ambulance subscription program in the fire department. Additional strategies include new revenues through a 2022 potential ballot measure or measures, fostering and supporting the economic ecosystem for constituent revenue growth, and seeking partnerships and leveraging investments, for example, the Home Key project. On the expense side, the city continues to evaluate service delivery prioritization and changes, continues proactive measures to address long-term liabilities, which includes contributions above required payments to pension and OPEB trusts, and the pension funding policy to achieve a target funded status. The city also continues to strive to contain costs while balancing recruitment and retention market forces, and continues to seek partnerships, collaborations, and new ways of doing business. For example, remote and virtual support and regional collaboration. And then also the fire department issues a 5-year strategic plan that engages the community in a planning process to guide the goals, objectives, and optimization of resources. The current report is for the period of 2018 to 2024, and a link is provided here for reference.
And Jesse, just a quick interruption here. And I don't think this is a surprise to anybody on this committee, but what the referral was, how do we deal with these kind of systemic cost changes and revenue changes? And I think this slide pretty much sums it up, that there's no silver bullet, and that it takes a combination of strategies and priorities and just frankly diligence as we continue to manage things, because we recognize as an organization by the guidance of the council that just reducing headcount is not our only option, which is why, as part of that fiscal sustainability framework, it's a triangle of things, right? It's our service levels, it's what it costs to actually deliver that service, as well as the revenues that we can either generate for that service or the broader revenues in terms of the economic base of the Palo Alto community. So hopefully not a surprise to anyone on this committee. I don't suspect so, given the tenure of the members. Just wanted to really frankly highlight if folks in the public are also wondering, so what's the answer? I think this slide kind of highlights that there is no single answer. The answer is that fiscal sustainability and managing it is frankly an ethos of value of this organization, and continuing to pursue it through a number of opportunities is the approach and way to try and manage all the components of it. So sorry, Jesse, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Next slide. Timeline and next steps or updates for the budget process. Staff will continue to provide updates to the City Council regarding the financial outlook of the city as new information becomes available. Most recently, we came with a preliminary Q1 fiscal year 2022 status in October. And we'll continue to use the budget process to facilitate the public discussion on services to the community. Upcoming agenda items to both the Finance Committee and City Council in November include the continued discussion of the 2022 ballot measure, the fiscal year 2021 annual comprehensive financial report, and year end. In December, we'll return with the final Q1 fiscal year 2022 financial report and the fiscal year 2023 to 2032 long range financial forecast. In February, we'll return with the 2022 mid-year review and preliminary Q2 financial status. Throughout May and June, we'll return for the fiscal year 2023 budget deliberations and City Council adoption of the fiscal year 2023 budget. And then in fall 2022, we'll return with the transmittal of the June 30th, 2021 CalPERS annual evaluation and the pension funding policy check-in. Next slide, please. Actions and next steps. There's no formal action necessary from the Finance Committee. We're here to discuss the referral to review the public safety long-term financial trends, beginning with the fire department, looking for feedback for consideration as staff prepares for the check-in on the pension funding status and the biannual OPEB studies this calendar year. And here to continue to support the council value of financial sustainability through various strategies, as well as seeking new opportunities. And with that, I'll conclude the presentation. Thank you so much, Ms. Deschamps, and everyone who participated. We'll now turn to the public to see if there's anyone who would like to address us. Feel free to raise your hand in Zoom. I don't believe we have anyone on the phone. And Jonah Peters, you will be first. You have 3 minutes. Go ahead. Looks like you need to unmute from your side.
Hi there.
Hi, go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm Jonah Peters, Secretary of Local 1319, Palo Alto Professional Firefighters. Since 1974, our department has provided paramedic transport. To this day, we are still the only department in this county to provide this service to its community and this revenue stream to our city. Fire department labor and management have worked together over the years to find innovative ways to provide this level of medical service, but the fact remains that we are an all-risk department. We provided this high level of transport service despite, as your report highlights, a 36% reduction in department headcount in the last 10 years alone. We've shifted personnel away from fire, rescue, hazmat, and wildland-oriented apparatus in order to provide this high level of service. We're unique in the large revenue streams we bring in, offsetting our expenses, as your report clearly outlines. Many of these revenue streams have been the result of collective work by our union and fire department administration working together. Transport fees, inspection fees, Stanford contract, hazmat fees, Cal OES mutual aid agreements, to name a few. As the report clearly states, we operate at roughly half the cost of our comparable neighboring agencies. This is no accident. We're roughly half the cost because of decades of consistent cuts to service, including services as vital as fire protection, which has been trimmed to the bone this year, while other services that we previously provided have been eliminated entirely. Perhaps for the first time ever, this fire department has a real retention problem. Significant cuts to service have resulted in unprecedented levels of mandatory overtime. Similarly, we're seeing increased levels of workers' compensation claims. This is not a coincidence. The city has chosen to reduce its service to dangerous levels in the name of innovation while ignoring the fallout. So far this year alone, 4 firefighters have left for other jobs, with more likely coming soon. In the face of continued reductions, we've seen steadily increasing call volume, nearly year-round fire season, and massive growth on Stanford's campus. We cannot continue at this pace. It's unsustainable, and it's causing your employees to leave faster than you can hire them. The city should prioritize investing in the safety of the community by investing in its employees. If the city continually cuts fire department service levels and resources year after year, we will not attract or retain quality employees, thereby sticking the city with a new bill, one to fund a continual revolving door. The city must remain competitive with neighboring agencies while placing a high value on vital service levels to the community. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Would anyone else like to address us? I don't see anyone else. Would the clerk please confirm?
Yes, Chair Cormack, we have no other speakers for this item.
All right, then I will return to my colleagues on the committee. Who would like to go first? Councilmember Philseth, looks like you're reaching for some version of your hand. Yes, there you go.
Sure, I will.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you folks very much for doing this. This is sort of, I think you said it right. It's that we've been watching this closely enough. There aren't any major surprises here, but it's helpful nonetheless, right? if you, can you go back to the slide with the green line and the blue line?
Slide 7.
Yeah, that one. I think, yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear how we've managed this. And innovation and service delivery and so forth is by the chief and Chief Nickel before Chief Blacksher and so forth is what's been able to achieve this. And you know that surely cannot scale forever. One notable thing here is that the blue line flattens significantly in 2020, 2021, and now 2022. And that's probably not sustainable either, because it's probably pandemic related, and we gouged every department because of the pandemic. So I would assume that we're going to sort of go back towards the track that we were in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. So I think that's, that's what we got to be looking at. And as Director Nose says, there's not one magic bullet here, but we're going to have to sort of work a lot of different sides on the polygon. One of the things that I really noticed looking at the numbers is, most of the metrics, expenses, most of the expense, and well, so the revenues aren't growing, and that sort of sort of accelerates augments sort of the standoutness of the expenses. But most of the expenses look like they're growing at sort of reasonable levels, except for pension expense, which is growing 16% a year, 17% a year, or something like that. And our ability to control that one is not infinite. In many ways, we're paying bills that were run up, at the turn of the millennia, right? And they're appearing now. Let's see. I did want to ask. I did notice that the workers' comp went up dramatically at the beginning of the pandemic. It looked like it sort of went up, 50% or something like that or more versus historical levels. Do we think that's gonna go back down as we get out of the pandemic, or do we think that's here to stay?
I'll take that a little bit and also ask hopefully Chief Blackshire to help from a line perspective. One of the main changes that you're seeing is actually that change in what classifies under workers' compensation.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so that I think Ms. Deschamps identified that stress basically is now an eligible component of it. And as a first responder, that systemic level of it, which is something that we are seeing obviously as a new case that can be treated under workers' compensation. That is obviously, we have cases under that scenario. And so that's an area where we didn't necessarily have folks out for those medical cases, but now we do. I don't think that's the only instance in why you see that spike. That is, though, one of the more recent, I can't remember exactly what fiscal year it occurred in, but that is a more recent legal or change in the law, rather, that has changed how and what the population of workers' comp claims are.
And from a line perspective, so I'll just talk in general.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, with personnel, eliminating positions and having fewer people in suppression doing the same amount of work, or doing the same amount of work, injuries are, almost unavoidable, because the call volume has gone down a little bit during the pandemic because we just didn't have the influx of population that we were, visitors and the population of Stanford. But we're starting to get back to, at least with transports, we're getting back to pre-COVID levels. But the call volume over the years has been going up as our workforce has been going down. So we have fewer people doing the same amount of work as that did before. So, it's just the more work they're doing, sometimes injuries are inevitable. So hopefully we can manage that by the way we, deploy our personnel, but we're hoping to recover with some of these vacancies. With the SAFER grant, it's going to be very helpful if we can get more people on board, because the workforce is really, really looking forward to filling some of those spaces to provide some relief.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, I think our challenge is to is to make these curves look more like each other without sort of continuing the green line on the trajectory it's been on for the last 15 years. Thanks.
Vice Mayor Burt.
Yeah, thanks. So first, I wanted to dig a little deeper into, there was a reference, I believe, in the report that spoke about how the overtime was driven largely by vacancies, or certainly very exacerbated by them. Do we have dollar figures on, we've always had, a strong level of overtime and expenses, and it fluctuates somewhat over the years, but we have a baseline that is kind of the norm, if there is such a number, but approximately. What I'm interested in is how much increase we've had in that overtime. And it's really, part of it is as we've reduced the staff even more, the number of hours that per worker of overtime could go up, even if the absolute number of hours of overtime didn't go up as much. So I'm interested in either of those numbers. How much did overtime go up, and how much has it gone up per worker, if we have any data on that?
Sure. And I'm sure Gio and Amber are chatting. I'm not quite sure that we have that information with us tonight. I understand the question, Vice Mayor, and frankly, based on issues that you've already identified, the table on packet page 16, when you look at overtime, is not going to tell us those metrics. So it's really only going to give us the financial picture. And there's a number of things that are occurring in those finances, right? As salaries change, the rate of overtime cost is going to change. There are also other things in that financial number, and I know operational things that impacted the level of overtime historically. For example, when we were going through the Stanford negotiation, we were for years holding vacancies in anticipation for the resolution of that, to make sure that we didn't need to do any forced separation of our employees. And so while we hadn't yet changed the deployment model, but we were running with 10 plus vacancies, you're seeing spikes in overtime hours during those periods. So I'll let Chief let us know if we have that actual information of hours by employee. I'm not sure that we do, but you are right in that it is fluctuating. And one of the main metrics that the team is trying to do in the fire department with the new deployment model in August is actually reduce the force backs. And so I think they did a phenomenal job last year, really trying to reduce the overtime. Obviously, I'm sure that has something to do with the lower call volume from COVID, and not as many large strike team deployments. So that's the other thing to consider from a fire perspective. We do send our fire staff to strike teams, whether it be for COVID or for wildfires. But I think you're spot on in that sense. I'm just not sure that we have the specific metrics.
Well, and what I'm hoping we can flesh out, whether it's tonight or in a follow-up, is to understand how much we're really saving when we cut positions beyond a certain point and end up making them up in overtime. And are we having a net saving from doing that, or are we? And in that calculation, we should add back in what we can attribute to the increase in workers' comp as a result of that additional overtime. So when you put those two things together, do we really win, even on a purely financial standpoint, not to mention the service and the lack of what I would describe as maybe unsustainable staffing now. We talk about financial sustainability, but it really is becoming apparent that here and elsewhere in our organization, we may have reached past a tipping point where we're at unsustainable staffing levels. That's aside or connected to the reduction in services to the community that occur from that, but just in terms of our impact on ability to recruit and retain. So it sounds like we don't have that sense of the financial impacts of those cuts on increases of overtime and workers' comp and how those two balance out. Is that correct?
Definitely not the matrix of all of those. I wonder if the fire department might have average overtime per person, but I will also caution, there is a period of time in this history where overtime was part of the schedule. When we implemented the new deployment model for Stanford, we did a 12-hour medic on overtime. So that was part of the deployment model, the deployment schedule. So I hear what you're saying, Vice Mayor. I'll be honest,
Well, that's why I put some qualifiers in there, understanding that there were different fluctuations and other factors over time, but having those shouldn't mean that we don't attempt to come up with at least good estimates of what's the impact of cuts on the net financial savings or lack thereof. We think we cut positions, we cut service when we cut positions. We are apparently endangering unsustainable staffing, but did we even really save money is the question? And if so, how much?
So doing a little bit of, a quick calculator wrangling here. And again, there's limitations to this because this is dollars, not hours. But the overtime expense per head doesn't seem to have changed very much in the last 4 or 5 years, even though the overall overtime expense is trending slightly down over the last 4 or 5 years, but headcount is trending slightly down over the last 4 or 5 years too. And it's not obvious that there's been a huge shift in overtime. And if you look at sort of the combination of salary expense and overtime expense, it's bumped around a little bit. The ratio of those two has bumped around a little bit, but it hasn't changed dramatically. And so, again, but this is dollars, not hours. And I think you're right. You really need to look at hours, right? Because that's the human side of this. But from a purely financial side, it's not obvious that there's been a huge shift there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Let me just say, with thanks to Councilmember Phil Seth and his auxiliary spreadsheet, I do see that Ms. Cameron has joined us. Did you have something you wanted to add as the analyst for this department?
Sure, thank you. Amber Cameron, Fire Department Senior Management Analyst. I just wanted to make myself seen and available if you did have a specific question. We don't have the hours per year on hand. We could get that, but just to echo what Kylie had said earlier, it really does depend on what each year looks like and what's been going on. We have the majority of our overtime is generated from online vacancies, whether that is from actual vacancies from positions that aren't filled or from people taking vacation, sick leave, those folks that are out on workers' comp. And those trends do change year to year. And like Kylie had said, we had artificially held a few positions vacant for many years while negotiating the Stanford contract. And right at the beginning of 2020, prior to the pandemic, we were all looking forward to the very first year we were going to be fully staffed to kind of see how overtime would play out in a fully staffed model. But then, we had to make cuts due to the pandemic. And so we did see overtime go down a little bit in fiscal year 21, but it's ticking back up because we reduced positions and have had some folks leave and a lot of folks on workers' comp. So the drivers behind it change every year.
And those were 15 positions during negotiations that were held open.
Okay, thanks. And I thought it was informative to show the comparison of general fund expenditures in the surrounding cities. Of course, Menlo Park and East Palo Alto have a fire district, so you had to go to Redwood City and Mountain View. But that was very informative that we're a significantly lower percentage. It goes into one of our papers, just had an article talking about losses or deficits. I forget how they framed it, as if the fire department is supposed to be a break-even cost recovery system. And I think it's important for us to make sure we're framing that clearly. That is not how fire departments are operated. We happen to have an exceptionally high cost recovery, but most fire departments are very low. And that brings me to another question. I'm not sure that you have this info, but I think it'd be useful is to look at the relative cost recovery of those other departments. I don't know if did we happen to see that as well? That's okay, I understand, but those, Amber, did you have anything to add there?
Are you asking specifically if we looked at the revenue generated from other city departments? Yes. So
yeah, the percentage of their budget that was returned in that revenue, so that basically their cost recovery percentage.
Yeah, so those net costs, the general funds percentages do account for the revenue that they bring in, and those other cities really bring in very small amounts of revenue from fees and things like that, like under the $10,000 mark a year. So, we really are very unique in that we have the Stanford contract and the ambulance service. So yeah.
And out of fairness to those other cities, it's not an apples to apples comparison, but when we are looking at this kind of perception that we need to have the public understand the realities here. And part of that is when it's put out in the press that we have these deficits, when in reality, we have a lower percentage, far lower percentage of our general fund budget that goes to fire than other cities, and a far higher percentage of cost recovery. Those are important things to share, including that latter one. Now, we kind of dismiss it because we understand we're in a different model and we have a client in Stanford, but they're still useful reference points.
I kind of agree that we ought to, that bears looking at. I am going to note here though that, all of us here, every time one of our other colleagues hauls out some number he saw in a different city, and we all sort of go, yeah, we got to look at that and make sure we're talking apples to apples here. And I think that's good practice across the board.
Yep. So then, I do want to say that when we move from a whole series of over about a 7-year period of staffing reductions that were very deliberate, and they were difficult, but they were by design, by trying to improve our delivery models and efficiencies. And then we've gone now with the Station 2 brownout. We're really what I would describe as understaffed. And I think we just need to acknowledge that. We've had a tremendous problem with public safety expenses rising far higher than inflation and than revenue rates. And that's certainly been a critical challenge that we've all recognized, and we've made real inroads there. But at a certain point in time, we're clearly not just looking at innovative, resourceful ways to become more efficient in our delivery. We're delivering less. And And I think we need to acknowledge that. And that brings me to, it's on page 8. I don't think we had it in the slides, the CalPERS projected rates, which are really have been the principal driver in that public safety expenses going up at higher rates in revenues and inflation. And we've had this incredibly steep increase from fiscal year 2012, so really starting in 2011, to where we are now, and we're almost at a flattening of this curve. And it went from 30% to over 70% by the peak at fiscal year 2025, which is just 3 years away is our peak. We only have a fairly nominal increase between now and then. We're at 69.6. We're projected to go to, well, it's more than nominal, 74%. There we go. Thank you. And so we need to get over a hump here. The good news is we're no longer in a period where we're seeing that steady and rapid escalation of these costs. But we're still carrying a big hit every year. So we have to figure out how to get through the next several years before we start getting a little bit of a decline, and then a decade before we really get a substantial decline. And within a decade, we're on a trend. Even, we look at that FY 2036 that we had a goal to get to 90% funding by, and frankly, those outlying years, that the latter 5 to 10 years of that 15-year cycle, in some ways it gets easier to achieve that goal than it is right now. Now is our toughest period. It happens to be the toughest period while our overall revenues are in bad shape. So that's the challenge. That's not offering a solution, but it is offering a vision that this is not a situation that is going to continue to worsen like it has for the last decade. It's been really a bad problem for the last decade. We're still in that problem, but it doesn't continue to worsen. And in fact, after 3 years, it begins to get modestly better, and that's good news. So that's what we're facing. It's certainly the safer funds are really valuable. And in some ways, if we look at the alignment between the 3 years of funding those positions and 3 years until we peak in our obligations to the percentage of payments to CalPERS, those two things happen to align roughly. So that gives us a bridge. The safer funds give us a bridge until we're in a period where we're hopefully seeing both revenues recover and some decline in these rates. We got to figure out how to get further from here to there. Safer is a big part of that. So I think those are my prime questions and comments. I may have one or two at the end, but thanks.
Starting to feel like the three of us are spending too much time together, because I'm just mostly nodding my head as, Council Member Philseth on slide 7, I thought was, super helpful. And Vice Mayor Byrd, the table on page 8 were the ones that I wanted to talk about. Let me just start by saying that 11 years of numbers were very helpful in this context. We don't often go that far back, and often we go 5 years forward, whatever. And this time, particularly for this department, I think was, particularly useful. So I just want to thank staff for taking the time to do that and to provide that really helpful slide 7. So just a few comments. So also helpful, of course, to see the comps, the percent of general fund. I leap to say that, apples to apples. So our general fund supports a lot of things that some of those communities don't have. Nevertheless, it's one benchmark, right? It's one thing we can look at to figure out, how are we doing, Is there something else we should be looking at? I guess one of the phraseologies we used with infrastructure is catch up and keep up. And really what we're doing with pensions is catching up. I don't know that the community understands that. And that's really what we're doing. And that table 8, I think, is the clear part. Like we're catching up. And it's not about the people that we have today so much. It's really, we talk about it as a percent of payroll, but that's not really accurate in terms of the liability that we have. So I know it's a nuance that only those of us who have extra time to spend on this may appreciate, but I think it is important. I literally had written down that SAFER is a bridge. Maybe we're all just getting excited about the new bridge coming in a week and a half. And the question is to what, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So couple sort of, let me just see if it is very large spider. Tom, spider. Sorry, it's post Halloween, but I'm like, no, I think that's a little much for me. Sorry, just one moment. Okay, all right.
Eat bugs.
Yeah, I don't mind the dog. I'm like, that's fine. But I'm like, ooh, okay, all right. Yeah, this is why I was so happy to come back into council chambers last night. Anyway, no animals. All right. So a theme we heard today, I think more clearly than we had, is that vacancies, and again, thank you for the clarification. It's not just positions we haven't filled, it's also people not at their job that day, have required more mandatory overtime lately than before, and that it appears to be linked directly to injuries. And the question I want to understand is that a direct line? Is it the vacancies, the mandatory overtime to injuries, or is it slightly more complicated about, and we shouldn't think of it that in that simplistic a manner?
Take that? Sure. So, it's, without doing a lot of research on this and really trying to get into the weeds on what's causing it, I can say, from the communication from suppression personnel is that, it's been a rough, almost 2 years now, not only with, the fires in the summer of 21, then we had the pandemic, and, they're, if I'm being just frank, they're getting burned out. The days off, they want the days off, they want to come here, work a hard shift, and then get their days off. And when people are either calling in sick, or they're off for being affected by COVID or workers' comp, we fill those spots so we can provide the service to the community. We keep those units in service. We don't take units out of service because someone doesn't show up, because that's how we meet our benchmark, meet our standard. That's how we provide that service. So I believe that our suppression personnel are just getting burned out, and they want to go home on their days off. And when we fill those spots, we have to fill a lot of spots. There's a certain amount of vacations afforded to them a day, and et cetera. And so those spots have to be filled. So I think that's really over the last 2 years, it's been significant. And this summer was the first summer that we weren't able to send, we got requests for mutual aid, but we weren't able to send an engine to assist, because that would have given 4 more vacancies on top of the, on average 10 to 12 vacancies a day that we're trying to fill. And that would have been really taxing. So we put our workforce before others. We're trying to take care of this community and our people first. But it was, as much as they wanted to go on the fires, but, it was my call to make sure that, we advised the op area coordinator that we would not be participating in mutual aid this year on a statewide system.
Was another part of that decision the fact that we fully staffed Fire Station 8, even though it was every other month?
Well, yeah, that was part of it. We didn't go into that without talking to labor. Any decision like that would have impact on them. They were aware of it, and they're aware of the impact. And I think the fact that it was every other month did give a little bit of a breather before 30 days. But even before that, it was a hardship. The mandatory overtimes were a hardship, and that just added to it. But again, we're here to provide a service, and I think it's a very beneficial, not only for the potential of fire in the hills, but also the collaboration between agencies. I think that was very valuable and showed how beneficial it is when we work together. But yeah, that with or without Station 8, it was a hardship.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being frank about how your team is doing. I think we all need to acknowledge, whether it's ourselves and in this format or our day jobs, the toll that the pandemic has taken on us, and it's starting to show, right? And this isn't necessarily the Great Resignation in this instance, but this is an example of people saying, I need a break, and now I need a break. I really hung with you as long as you needed it, but there are limits. So I think City Manager Shikata said at the beginning that you were either the guinea pig or the leader, but maybe this is part of broaching a discussion that gets to something I think I've spoken about before. At a certain point, more money necessarily isn't going to help if we aren't figuring out who's working and how they're working together. Maybe more money helps because there's more people. I'm not going to say that that isn't part of it. It's a huge part of it. But I think there's a little bit more to that. So thank you for walking me through that. I had a sort of random idea when you were walking through some of these things. Is it at all possible that a 911 call could ever be like FaceTime, Zoom, Skype, and there would be any virtual or remote assessment or conversation? I haven't heard about that, but if you think about some of the things that have changed during this time in telehealth, and it might be a terrible idea, but I just throw it out to say, like, is that something that anyone has tried or thought about?
So I will say that there have been some innovative efforts in other agencies that I'm aware of. Telehealth is one it is gaining ground. Another one is I know of fire departments that actually staff their comm center with registered nurses, so they can help triage some of these calls and give advice over the phone. So there are ways to do that, but again, that's just more staffing.
Yeah.
So
but it's like, when you've been one of those people like on the phone waiting for the advice nurse, the overnight, and sometimes you're panicked that it's or maybe it was just me, that it's an emergency. I didn't call 911, but I just think it's something worth thinking about, especially to the extent that so many of them are medical and we're all, told like when in doubt, call and help will come. I think it's just something to think about, especially as people get more comfortable with, even if it just ends up being information that's provided to your team as they're en route, maybe they can be seeing what something looks like or preparing. It's just a thought I wanted to add.
We currently have a system in place. It's emergency medical dispatch, and when the dispatcher takes the call and they're getting information, the dispatcher goes through a flow. It's like it's a chart that they go through by putting in the symptoms of their illness, and based on that, it determines the level of acuity on that call. So is that alpha would be a really low acuity, and a delta or echo is a really high acuity, and our response model is based on that. So if it's a lower acuity call, we respond differently than we do a higher acuity call. Yeah. So there is a component of that, but I understand what you're saying. There's probably even ways on top of that.
Especially if you think about the amount of information that your people are having to take
Sure.
orally by listening, and how much faster it is sometimes to see something. Just a thought.
Sure.
Councilmember Fiscal, did you have a question on this topic or?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I've got another one for.
Okay. And then where I really wanted to end up was something that was, I think, very briefly referenced at the beginning. And I wonder, I think it was the city manager, should we be thinking of this as a fixed service in some respects? That fire and ambulance services are a fixed service and the cost varies. I think you were using the utility, right? We're not gonna not provide electricity. Everybody's gonna get electricity, and if it costs more, it costs more. I think that's an actually sort of interesting way to think about this in particular, this department in particular. And and I think then we could shift from, FTE and things like that, which we would obviously need to know, into what is sort of a healthy, sustainable, and I'm sure we're not the only department, right? If you have to staff X number of, I'm going to get all the words wrong, I'm just going to say vehicles, right? Rigs with trucks. It's one of those words. Somebody tell me.
Apparatus. What they call it.
Apparatus. Thank you. If you have to staff X number, and I understand it's complicated, but like, what would be the right amount of I'm going to say excess or slack number of people to have to accommodate, not just for, the vacations that we have, but Family Medical Leave Act, parental leave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I know we build these models in other places and times, and sort of build from the bottom up instead of sort of coming from the top down. Because let's acknowledge, right, that how much change has happened in the department in the past. It's now, 9 years, pretty significant, and all for understandable reasons. But maybe we need to rethink this a little bit, build from the bottom up, and build in, and I think people will understand, right? They'll understand that if someone's gone, or training, right? I think that's the other thing we haven't talked about yet tonight is training. Is there sufficient time for release for training? Do you have the training captains that you need? So that's just something for some food for thought as we take another round. And if you have thoughts on that, open to hearing them.
Yeah, Chief.
Okay, just making
Go
sure
ahead.
that was. I didn't
There
want
you
to cut
go.
you off. So we do have a training captain and we do have a training battalion chief, but I will say that something that is challenging is making sure that our crews get the mandatory overtime while they're on duty, because as we have reduced resources and emergencies come in, they have to occasionally, and it's very common, leave that training to run the emergency, even though other units are covering, because sometimes it just gets busy. But what we can't do is not respond. And so, trying to figure out how we have coverage during the training hours is one of our challenges that we're trying to solve.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Philseth.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that did sort of stick out at me as I was looking through this, and I've seen these numbers before, but I don't know, maybe didn't think about them as much. You guys have get a lot of false calls, right? I mean, it looked like maybe a third or something like that. Is it really that much?
Yeah, there's quite a few false calls, and that's really what's driving the two things: the fee that we're going to be, the program that we're coming up with to capture those that are repeat offenders, because it is
right. You said it was mostly construction sites too, or that's
correct. Correct. So that's one, and the other, and we proposed this in the last budget, is that we're going to come up with a model where we reevaluate the emergencies that we respond to, or the false emergencies, if you will.
Right.
So we can keep the crews available to respond to those real higher acuity calls, because it is a waste of resources to continue to go on these calls. And sometimes not necessarily just continue, but to run one time on a call and take that unit out of service. That's a valuable piece of equipment that should be ready to respond to other calls. So
yeah, I mean, it seemed, I mean, the reciprocal sort of, if you didn't get any false calls, then you'd have a 50% bigger team.
Right. So
right. So I wonder I know you guys are thinking about that one, but that one leapt out at me as boy, is there some way to, is there some way to mine that one for, and you guys are working on it. Sounds like you guys are working on it. Is if it's might be a false call, then maybe one person goes out first before the rest go in, or something like that. I mean, sort of thinking about the service models around those.
yeah, so false alarms are about 11% of our calls.
Oh, look like 30% so that's much less than it looked like in the staff report.
But it's still, I mean, we're talking about 11% of, on a regular year, almost 9,000 calls. So it's still significant.
A lot of calls. Yeah.
Especially the one call that we got most during the rain was the false alarms. For whatever reason, when water comes down, those alarms start going off. But as we work through this, we really have to be cognizant of what buildings or what occupancies we will and will not respond to because of the, who's in the building, what's the hazard, if it is a fire, how much work is it going to be to get them out if it's an actual fire as opposed to an empty building or something under construction. So I wish it was something we could just say we're just not going to respond to fire alarms.
Sure, of course.
But it is, I think due diligence, regardless of, cause, I think we should always be reevaluating how we're responding to these, to all emergencies and making sure that we have the right resources to the right call.
So I thought it was more than 11% reading this. So okay.
Councilmember Philseth, you are referring to page 2, packet page 4 of the report, and it's not just false alarm. It's good intent as well. So
Yes.
I think that's the difference in the number.
Correct.
So false alarm is a component of those.
Correct.
And could you refresh our memory on good intent? That's
Where someone thought it was an emergency and it ended up not being an emergency, so it was just a good intent.
yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty sure
Cat
that's
up
what
the
happened
tree.
the one time I called because like the chicken breast caught on fire in the oven and I freaked out. And by the
But-
time they got here, it was no longer an emergency.
But it's an emergency to you. That's
It
what's
sure as
important.
heck was.
Yeah,
I was
it's
like, there's a
emergency.
fire. I'm calling 911.
Absolutely. We don't want to discourage anyone from calling, but
Sorry, Eric, back to you.
I mean, just out of curiosity, are the good intent calls? I mean, are most good intent calls fire calls as opposed to medical calls and vice versa, or is it just all across the board?
yeah, it's across the board. Sometimes, let's say someone's sleeping and they think that someone fell out or had a heart attack or something, and we
Okay.
find
Yeah.
out that, oh, they were just sleeping, fell asleep on a bench at a
Right.
bus stop. Sometimes someone sees a flicker, thinks it's a fire, and it's just a reflection. We get those. Someone thinks that it's a hazardous material that's spilled and it's pollen over a puddle, and pollen, it has that almost fluorescent look sometimes. It looks like a hazardous
Okay.
material and ends up being nothing. So it's all over the board.
I wouldn't have guessed that one. Okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
In my own defense, it literally was on fire at the beginning. Just saying.
But
and
was
the
it?
proverbial-
But it was. But was the blackened chicken good?
Literally the firefighters said when they left, it's still edible. And I was like, no, not happening.
Well, it's the proverbial cat.
Those
up the
guys were
tree.
tough.
It's the proverbial cat up the tree and whether the cat would have come down by itself in good time.
All right,
Okay.
Eric, sorry, Eric, all right, is that it for this round?
Yeah, pretty much. The one thing I would do is that the chart that shows the pension expense tapering off in 26 or 27. I think we'll be really lucky if that actually materializes. I think a lot of the the reality is it doesn't come from CalPERS changing the discount rate. That just pushes it around in time. The debt is the debt, right? That said, a lot of the escalation over the last decade has been CalPERS cutting their discount rate from 8 to 7.75 to 7 and so forth. And I think it's pretty likely that CalPERS is going to have to cut it again one of these days, and then that's going to extend. So, love to be wrong on that. If we can make if CalPERS can make 20% a year every year for the next 5 years, that'd be just awesome, right? But I think that chart's pretty risky.
Okay, Vice Mayor Burt.
Yeah, well, then following up on that chart, it's not based upon CalPERS making those kinds of percentages. But one of the things that I think is a factor there is the migration of what percentage of workers are in different pension tiers. Is that correct, Kylie?
I'm actually going to ask Jesse on this one. I can't recall where CalPERS is at in terms of their smoothing of Pepper employees over the 3 decades. Do you recall, Jesse?
I'm so sorry. I got like a glitch. I didn't hear that question.
No problem. Do you do you know where CalPERS is at in terms of the rate of attrition, moving from classic membership to pepper membership in their long-term forecast?
In their
And how much of that trend is attributable to that progression?
in their assumptions.
Right.
I'm not sure what their assumptions are for the shift of employees into PEPRA.
They have some in it.
Yeah.
I just
They
don't
do.
know that it's, I can't remember if they've modified safety versus miscellaneous. The change is obviously different between the two, just based on the industries. But you will see obviously in that table that when you go out, right, over the, frankly, work lifespan, for lack of a better word, of your classic membership, at the end of that table, you see that you're back at just the normal cost. Because the thought process is that, you know, the PEPRA is designed to be a cost sharing benefit and, you know, mitigate that kind of historic liability accumulation that the prior versions of the benefits have accumulated, for lack of a better word. So there are many assumptions in it. I will say that the just to kind of round out what Vice Mayor and Councilmember Filsa have been talking about, we will know sooner rather than later any changes for CalPERS. So actually really important for us is going to be November 15th of this year. CalPERS is actually reviewing all of these assumptions. So they're looking at their rate of return. They're looking at the allocation of assets. They're looking at things like medical costs, frankly, mortality rates. And they're also looking at inflation, which is a really interesting one given where we're at today. And so they're redoing what will be their baseline assumptions for a 4-year period of time. Just to go back to what I think Councilmember Fields said, which is the last time they did this study, they brought the discount rate down. And so they moved it from whatever 7.5 or something down to 7. And so it is not unheard of for obviously them to take as they continue to de-risk their portfolio. And they will likely make assumption changes. They've already told us through their numerous outlets. And even with their risk mitigation policy, with the high returns that they received in the market in 2021, already that reduces the discount rate from 7 to 6.8. Just no decisions, that's already part of a policy. So no matter what, that will change moving forward. And the question for the 15th is really, do they bring it down further? And so they're got a number of scenarios that they have been directed by the board to bring back to the board for review. And they're looking at anything from, you know, less than 6% up to 7%, and are looking at different scenarios. So stay tuned. This happens every 4 years, like I said, so it will be an interesting and important adjustment for us to be watching.
The next, thanks to the Chief for clarifying on the impact of our current staffing on our ability to participate in strike forces for wildfires. And I had understood that to be the case, and then in the staff report, it kind of continued to just refer to that as an ongoing reimbursement, but without giving us that really that context that we've cut back on that. What, Chief, to what degree have we cut back in our participation in with the strike forces?
This year, well, last year, if I'm not mistaken, we went out on 14 deployments last summer. Well, summer before last. This summer, we didn't send a unit out this time.
Wow.
Yeah, so we went down to 0.
So I think we and the public need to understand that we're staffed at a level that we can't even do what has always been our role, and most departments are able to do, so that we help each other. And we're going to need that help someday ourselves. We'll get it, but we're not able any longer, at least right now, to do our share of that. And it's fully compensated. We just don't have the staffing. So I did want to follow up on Allison's talking about needing to explain to the community that we've been in this catch-up period. I think that that's an important way to frame it, and I don't think the general public or even the council as a whole necessarily fully understands kind of the trends and the context of this, and laying our cards on the table on where we are, what the struggles we've been going through over the last decade, where we are today, and what we need to really be able to do to move into something that, and this is kind of my wrap up, which is we've been talking about sustainable finance, and it's becoming clear to me that we need to actually look at 3 elements to sustainability in our organization. It's sustainable finance, sustainable services, and a sustainable workforce. And we can't just think that we can look at sustainable finance and without fully balancing those against the other 2. That doesn't make our job any easier. It makes it harder, but it's the reality that we really must be facing. So I think that's something that we should consider framing going forward, and really talking about this with the public. And so a lot of what we've been talking about tonight, this has really helped us as a committee to have a fuller understanding, but we've got to figure out how do we first synthesize this in a way that really wraps it up for the council and for the community and for the press, because they really are who communicates to the community a lot. I think we need to be engaging with the press. Don't think of the press as necessarily adversarial, even though we may at times be not happy with how they report things. But I think that the better job we do of clearly sitting down, explaining situations, then the more likely that they're going to communicate things in a way that's important and accurate for the public to understand, because the support of the public is crucial for us to be able to get back to where we need to be. So those are my kind of final thoughts.
Okay, thanks for that. And then I'll come back to you next, Eric. So I like the idea of, sort of sustainability everywhere. We haven't talked about sustainability in the climate action plan with respect to fire, but we can toss that in there too. It should be like a dimension on everything. And I wonder if perhaps all of us collectively, I'm just thinking about this, can shift our language a little bit. The pandemic and the budget choices we made, and how everyone felt, was a huge shock. It was a shock to the system. It was a shock to our teams and to us as individuals. And now we're in this reset period. So I think it behooves us to, to take some time, which we're doing. And I so appreciate, this conversation, which is, I think, been much richer than we're able to do during budget, which really focused on the numbers and the deltas and things like that, and less about sort of like, where have we been coming from? Where are we going? How are the people really, really doing? I think that's been great. I guess a different way of thinking about this is, what is it that we really have to provide, right? And then what's the way that we do that? And then figure out matching the revenues to that. And we did not have the luxury of doing that last year, right? We didn't have time, and we didn't know where things were going. And we had bigger fiscal impacts, right, than almost all of our neighbors. And I'm not going to say we have the luxury of time now, but we do have a moment to sort of, turn the lens a bit and say, if we're going to have our fire department and we wanted to do all these great things we've been doing, and now we understand a little bit more the levers of, this many people, or, this much money is, and this is what's happening, and how do we feel about that? And, clearly, some of our employees spoke this evening. This has been a rough time. So I don't know if I'm making a ton of sense here, but if we view last year as a shock to the system, this is our opportunity to reset. And maybe we're not going to reset in the same way. You know, we're not just going to go back to where we were. We're going to say, can we do this a different way? I think for us to do that, well, we're going to have to agree to what has to happen and what's nice to have. And that's going to be where the rubber meets the road, right? And I think that won't so much be in this department, potentially be in others. So that's just something for us to think about as we head into budget. Councilmember Philsott.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, there was one more thing I wanted to ask the chief, right? Which is, you know, over the last several years, you folks have done some pretty innovative and clever things in terms of sort of flexibility of assignments and shifts and roles in order to cope with sort of that green line. And I know that at least in the past, you guys have sort of had some level of constraints on your ability to do that by the kind of equipment that you had. You know, this apparatus takes this many people, and we got so many of these over here and so many of those over there and so forth. Do you guys and gals, I mean, do you need different equipment? You know, as sort of the role has changed over time, that would help.
Well, the easy answer is yes. It is.
Cool.
Yeah. So, you know, as we have more responsibilities. For example, the 2-person squad
Right.
that we just put in service. That unit that we're using is a unit that we received from a grant years ago, and it's an air light unit, which means we fill the air bottles when they're fighting a fire and they come out and they have to refill their bottles. That's the unit that would fill the bottles. Previously, that was done with the rescue that was taken out of service when SLAC closed. So we took that out of service and we didn't have an air unit. And so even though we had received an air unit from the grant for a county resource, we didn't staff it. So even when we went on fires, we really had no way to bring that to the fire, to the scene of a fire. We'd actually have to call another agency to bring an air unit out to refill these bottles. And so it's actually worked in our benefit to have this squad where not only are we staffing the station 24 hours now, but now when we go on to a fire, we actually have a unit on scene that can refill air bottles, which leaves that resource in other cities. That's just one example of how the innovation that we're using to find different deployments is supported by vehicles that we didn't have really a need for before. We did have a need, but we can use it differently, and what kind of tools we keep on it, the type of personnel, and sometimes with training too, you know, how, you know, we try to keep a certain level of training or staff that are trained up to a technical level, whether it be rescue systems too. There's different levels of certificates that we have when we apply different services, and the training that we have to have and the tools that we have on the apparatus as well. So it changes over time because what we're asked to do.
Well, I wonder if, yeah, I mean, this is going to take a certain amount of creativity to get through this, and you would hate to find out that that, you know, equipment that's something that you know, if we were able to find a way to buy would enable us to, you know, basically pay people better, right? So that's one of those sides of if that's one of the sides of the polygon that we can work with, then we should do that, right? And if you guys need it.
Sure.
Okay.
We're looking at that. Thank you.
Occurs to me that getting a little out over my skis here tonight. If the fire department were to come with a plan that I hesitate to call like a build back better, but that's just what comes to mind, like, you know, a little bit of a rebuild, I think it would need to have multiple components. And the reason this would be the right time is the last time this committee met, we had a conversation about how the council needs to come up with what is it if we implement a business tax that we're going to be spending that money on. And I think this is a logical candidate. It's a different kind of investment. It's a service that's available to everyone. So just brainstorming here a little bit, definitely not in the spirit of emotion, but just thinking that, and maybe, you know, that's obviously up to the city manager to think about whether it's this department or all of them, but I think there's an opportunity here to, you know, use the phrase rebuild. Because we have done that with the fire stations. Fire Station 4 is still waiting, right? But that's part of the plan as well, right? Infrastructure and equipment and people and training. And that I think would be a package that would hopefully, you know, send a message to the people we hope will come work for us. Because it's a small pool, right? We expect a lot from the people who work for us, and not everyone is able to, you know, to participate. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because we also, you know, as much as we're into public education, that's one program that we had to pull back because of the lack of resources. You know, our efforts going out to the public, senior citizen homes, going out to schools, it's been reduced tremendously because we just didn't have the resources. So the focus is always on that emergency response and what we can do, but there's also the education of the public, you know, preventative measures. You know, if we never went on a fire again, that'd be great because that means we're doing our job in prevention, but, you know, people generate calls. But at the same time, you're right that it's, you know, it's emergency response, but it's also that what we can offer the public in education as well.
Well, that needs to get done because I think the fire prevention posters that are up in the hallway to City Hall, I'm pretty sure those have been there for a couple of years now. Guys might need to get out and do another round.
So you think the artists are now seniors in high school?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that, but I do think the next generation of kids should have an opportunity. All right. Does staff have anything else they want to add to our discussion? Things we've missed or gotten wrong?
I'll just chime in here a little bit to kind of draw on what I think many of you have talked about, which is we as an organization, ideally, fingers and toes all crossed, all economic indicators continue to move in a positive. 1 second.
I feel so much better.
Man, it's dog eat dog out there.
That's what usually used to happen to me, like at 5 o'clock on council meetings when the Amazon person would come by.
I'm so sorry.
No
I'm
worries.
not quite sure what's outside. It's dark. Perhaps a cat. Anyway, what I was saying is that we as an organization, we used fire as an example for the exercise tonight, but a few of you have alluded to the fact that this is not just a fire thing, and this is not even just a public safety thing. This is something that I think every director could sit here and spend oodles of time talking about kind of where we're at, where we want to go, and is a wonderful opportunity for the whole organization to, as we move in a recovery period, don't necessarily just immediately restore or build back how we were doing things. You know, and fire is a wonderful example of that, right? They've changed their deployment model in the wake of all of this, and they're testing it, seeing how it works. And so that will be a new component associated with how the chief evaluates, okay, well, where do we invest? You know, we are clearly understaffed, but where's the best kind of next move, so to speak? So I just want to make sure that folks are acknowledging and understand that this is a pervasive issue across the organization, across all of our lines of business. And to make one more connecting dot, that the discussion of what are our core, what are areas that we want to invest in is going to be a really big component of our ongoing discussion on the ballot measure. So one of the major items that this committee identified, and I think is part of, not I think, I know, is part of the initial round of polling, is really polling voter sentiment on the uses, frankly, of the funds. And so I think combined the polling, the work with the council body on what the uses are expected to be of if we were to pursue a ballot measure, as well as obviously departmental feedback that we already have direction to do as part of the Q1 report to, you know, come back. Where do we need to invest more? Where have we gone too deep? And what are some initial moves that we need to make are all part of part and parcel, I guess, to this whole kind of picture and framing of where we're at as an organization and the good work I think that folks like our chief have done in terms of innovation, and where I think that will also hopefully benefit us as we move out of this really tough period from the pandemic. And so anyway, I'll just wanted to kind of connect those dots for folks. I know the committee's well versed in these areas, but also for the public to kind of connect some of the other projects going on and how all of these things intersect.
And as we conclude this item, I just, want to take a moment to thank Chief Blackshire and Deputy Chief McNally, who stepped in ably for you over the summer, and everyone on your team for continuing to be there when we need you, especially through this super difficult time when you were really the first people out there and figuring out how are we gonna deal with the gowns. I remember like the weekly update on I can't even remember, there was some weird poncho you were trying to buy at some point because you were like, okay, plan C or D is we're gonna have to have this. So it's really important for us to acknowledge that. And if there are other ways we can do that, you should let us know. I did take cookies up to the firefighters at Foothill Station. I did go the month that it was our people. I probably should have gone the month that it was our county people as well. All right, that concludes our action item. And that brings us to future meetings and agendas, which I feel like we just spend a lot of quality time together. Director Nose.
Appreciate that, Chair Cormack. The committee has 2 scheduled meetings between now and the end of the calendar year, in which we will go over basically a look back and a look forward. So we do expect that we'll be bringing forward our 2021 financial reports for the committee's review, and then we will also be bringing forward our long-range financial plan as we both look at where we left and potentially where we're going. So we'll see you on the 30th of November and the 7th of December, I think.
Sounds like good bookends to the year. Thank you all so much. We're adjourned.
Hey, one more thing. Well, we got the chief here. Chief, thank you for leading the charge on vaccinations.
Oh, yeah, it was a team effort. It was getting the information out there and making it accessible, and the education also, and making sure that our workforce had exactly what they needed to engage. But the credit goes to them, because it was although many wanted it, some was very selfless and did it for the greater good, to be quite honest. So yeah, very, very proud of our team for stepping up, and to have that many get vaccinated that soon, it's really a tremendous feat.
Yeah,
and rightly so. Well done.
Another example of leadership, focus on public safety, true public servants. Pat?
yeah, and what your team did was not only excellent for itself, it was a model for the organization, and frankly, it was a model compared to other organizations in the area. So it had a lot of influence, I think.
Thank you.
All right, now we're adjourned.
Thank you. Good night.